Why are you someone's reason for needing a therapist? I came home from work the day after my dad's funeral and found my fiancé lying in our bathtub with his wrists cut open. His goodbye letter was taped to our mirror, and the poem he wrote for me back in 7th grade was playing on loop. My entire body went into shock as I started physically convulsing. I wanted to drop next to him and start pulling him out, but I have an extremely weak heart, and I'm prone to heart attacks, and seeing my fiancé dead less than 24 hours after I buried my own father triggered a severe stroke. I collapsed onto the floor where my vision went white, and I don't really remember anything, besides him suddenly leaping out of the bathtub and grabbing my shoulders before screaming, "It's a prank," over and over as my world shut black. I apparently died and was resuscitated, and when I woke up in the hospital 13 hours later, my fiancé was beside me holding a bouquet of flowers. The doctors told us that my heart is now 3 times weaker than before, and I was now at extreme risk of sudden cardiac death. They put me on 13 different medications and made it crystal clear that stress, even another prank, could literally kill me. That night, my fiancé came to me on his knees. He was crying and literally groveling. "I don't deserve you, but if you give me another chance, I promise I'll be better. I'll be the man you fell in love with again." I knew the safe decision was to say no, but this was the only time he'd ever done anything so stupid in the 13 years I'd know him. I told him I'd stay, but gave him a list of rules he now had to follow. For the first few months, he kept his word. We went to couples therapy. We slowly started laughing again, putting donut cream on others' noses and licking it off. He puffed my pillows and learned to cook for us. And when my grief about my dad hit, he'd find the perfect balance between giving just enough space and attention. Somewhere along the line, I started believing that nearly dying was the best thing that happened to me. But then he started going back to his old ways. Suddenly, he was blaring music while I was trying to sleep, groaning about being too busy to get my medicine when my chest pains hit. He cut his work hours down so I'd be motivated to get back to full time, and even started drinking at bars after work because I was stressing him out. Soon he was telling his friends he never wanted to stay in the relationship anyway. I had to start locking myself in our bedroom because he'd yell about how I demanded all this from him, but couldn't even give him intimacy. That's when it happened. I came out of the bathroom after getting my period, and when I turned the corner, he suddenly jumped out to scare me. I felt my heart literally freeze, and ended up on the floor palpitating and clutching my chest. I had to crawl to our medicine cabinet because he wouldn't help me. My heart stabilized, and that night I ran away. I immediately threw myself into my healing process, where at one of my support groups I met Cameron. His own father had abused his chronically ill mother in the past, so we connected on a deep level. We moved in, and he helped me regain strength. Not just mentally, but my doctor said my heart was healthier too. 4 years to the day after I left my ex-fiancé, I got a call at 10 a.m. It was him, and he sounded panicked. "Oh my God, finally, please help me." I didn't say anything, just waited for him to speak. "I've had a situation with my new girlfriend." I still wasn't saying anything. That's how I found out he might be going to prison. He'd assaulted his new girlfriend's mother. She called him out for putting alcohol over her daughter, so he attacked her and repeatedly punched her sternum. "Can you testify for me?" he asked. I was still silent. "Remember how I took care of you after you almost died? I'm a good guy who made a mistake." I still kept quiet. "I'll go to prison if you don't help. It'll be your fault." That's when I finally responded. "It's telling that you still think the consequences of your actions aren't your fault. What happened between us was different," he suddenly yelled. "I was stressed. You couldn't work and you expected me to do everything and you... That's your problem." I cut him off. I could tell he was taken aback because I'd never stood up to him before. "You almost culled me and still saw yourself as the victim. Now you beat an elderly woman, and somehow still see yourself as the victim." He went quiet. "But you know what?" I added. "I'll testify." "Wait, really?" The excitement in his voice made me sick. "Hey, Karina, I still love you." I told him I'll see him in court and hung up. On the day of, I walked in to see him shaking. We locked eyes, and his face just lit up and his body relaxed. He mouthed, "Thank you," before holding up a small love heart at me. My face stayed neutral. The whole trial, I sat in the back and watched the prosecutor rip him apart. He kept looking back at me like I was his only lifeline. So when it was finally my turn to get up on the stand, I looked right at him. And when asked for a description of his character, I made full eye contact. There's a lot of things I can say about Christopher. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I pause on the witness stand, letting that sentence hang in the air while my mind pulls me back to earlier that morning. I stood in the courthouse lobby with my pill organizer clicking in my coat pocket, watching Christopher pace near the courtroom doors about 30 feet away. He kept glancing over at me like he expected me to walk over and tell him everything would be okay, but I stayed exactly where Hannah told me to wait. My heart monitor beeped softly under my shirt, tracking every anxious spike in my pulse. Christopher's hands were shaking and he kept running them through his hair, and part of me recognized that nervous habit from 13 years of knowing him. But I didn't move. I just stood there feeling the weight of my emergency medications in my purse, and remembering how I got here. My brain flashed back to that day 4 years ago when I came home from Dad's funeral and found Christopher in our bathtub. The fake blood was everywhere, smeared on the white porcelain and dripping down the sides. That poem from 7th grade was playing on repeat through the bathroom speakers, the one about forever and always. My whole body started shaking so hard I couldn't control my arms or legs. I remember reaching toward him because I thought he was dead, and then my vision went completely white. Everything just disappeared into nothing. I woke up 13 hours later in a hospital bed with tubes coming out of my arms. The doctors stood around me with these serious faces and told me my heart was now 3 times weaker than it was before. One of them, an older woman with gray hair, looked right at Christopher and explained that another shock like that could kill me instantly. They put me on 13 different medications, lined up in orange bottles on the bedside table. A younger doctor made Christopher sit in the chair next to my bed while they went through each medication and what would happen if I didn't take them. He explained that stress wasn't just bad for me anymore, it was literally deadly. That night after the doctors left, Christopher got on his knees right there beside my hospital bed. He was crying so hard he could barely get the words out. His face was all red and wet, and he kept saying he'd be better, that he'd be the man I fell in love with again if I just didn't leave him. I knew saying yes was probably the stupidest thing I could do. But we'd been together for 13 years, and this was the first time he'd ever done something this bad. So I told him he could stay, but gave him a list of rules he had to follow. For the first few months after I got home from the hospital, things were actually good between us. We went to couples therapy every Tuesday evening and slowly started laughing again. We did silly things like putting donut cream on each other's noses at breakfast. He learned how to cook my safe foods, the ones that didn't make my heart race, and fluffed my pillows every single night before bed. When the grief about Dad hit me hard, Christopher somehow knew exactly when to give me space and when to hold me. But then he started slipping back into his old ways, so gradually I almost didn't notice it happening. The music got louder when I was trying to sleep, bass thumping through the walls. He started sighing really heavily when I asked him to pick up my medications from the pharmacy. He cut his work hours down to part-time and said it was to motivate me to get back to full-time, even though my doctors specifically said I couldn't handle that kind of stress yet. One night I came out of the bathroom after getting my period, and Christopher jumped out from around the corner. My heart literally stopped beating right for a few seconds, and I collapsed straight down onto the floor. I was clutching my chest and gasping while he just stood there watching me. I had to crawl across the carpet to the medicine cabinet by myself because he wouldn't help me get up. That's when I knew I had to leave. I grabbed what I could carry that same night while he was passed out drunk on the couch. I locked myself in my car with 2 bags of clothes and my medications, and my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel. I drove to a women's shelter across town. The numbness that settled over me during that drive felt safer than the fear, like my body was finally protecting itself the only way it knew how. At a support group for abuse survivors 2 weeks later, I met Cameron. His mom had been chronically ill and his dad had abused her for years, so he understood things I didn't have to explain out loud. He got how people use your illness against you and make you feel like you're the problem for being sick. We started talking after the meetings in the parking lot, and something about him felt steady in a way I'd forgotten was even possible. Over the next year, Cameron helped me build routines that actually worked for my health instead of against it. I took my medications on time every single day, went to all my doctor appointments, and slowly started processing the grief about Dad that I'd pushed way down inside. It wasn't dramatic or fast, just small improvements that added up over months and months. 18 months after I left Christopher, I sat in Dr. Yamaguchi's office while she pulled up my test results on her computer screen. She'd run a full cardiac workup that morning with an ECG, an echocardiogram, and about 6 different blood tests to check my medication levels. I watched her face while she scrolled through the numbers, trying to read whether the news was good or bad. Then she actually smiled, which was something I'd never seen her do before during an appointment. She turned the monitor toward me and pointed at a graph showing my heart function over the past year and a half. The line had gone up slightly. Not a huge jump, but definitely better than where I'd been right after leaving. She explained that my ejection fraction had improved from 32% to 38%, which meant my heart was pumping blood more effectively than it had in years. The stress reduction from leaving Christopher had probably saved my life, she said in her usual straightforward way. I started crying right there in her office. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when you realize you made the right choice even though it was the hardest thing you'd ever done. Dr. Yamaguchi handed me a tissue and told me to keep doing exactly what I was doing because it was working. 4 years to the day after I left, I was standing in my kitchen making scrambled eggs when my phone started buzzing on the counter. I glanced at the screen and saw Christopher's name, which I'd never deleted from my contacts even though I probably should have. My first instinct was to hit decline and block the number, but something made me swipe to answer instead. I didn't say anything, just held the phone to my ear and waited. His voice came through panicked and desperate, talking so fast I could barely understand him at first. He kept saying he needed my help, that he'd been trying to reach me for days, that this was an emergency. I stayed completely silent, not giving him anything to work with. Then he said he'd had a situation with his new girlfriend, and my stomach dropped because I knew whatever came next was going to be bad. He rambled for a while about how things had gotten out of hand, how he never meant for any of this to happen, how everyone was overreacting. I turned off the stove and sat down at my kitchen table, still not speaking. Finally, he admitted what had actually happened. He'd attacked his girlfriend's mother after she called him out for drinking too much around her daughter. He'd punched her in the chest repeatedly, hitting her sternum over and over until she fell down. Now he might go to prison because the old woman had pressed charges. The way he told the story made it sound like this was something happening to him, instead of something he'd done to someone else. When he asked if I would testify as a character witness for him, I didn't respond at first. He kept talking to fill the silence, reminding me how he took care of me after I almost died, calling himself a good guy who just made a mistake. He said everyone deserves a second chance, and I, of all people, should understand that since I'd given him one before. Then his voice changed and got harder. He said if I didn't help him, going to prison would be my fault. That's when I finally spoke up and told him it was telling that he still thought the consequences of his actions weren't his fault. He started yelling immediately, saying what happened between us was completely different, that he'd been stressed because I couldn't work, and I expected him to do everything. I cut him off and said that was exactly his problem. He almost killed me and still saw himself as the victim. Now he'd beaten an elderly woman and somehow still saw himself as the victim. He went quiet for a few seconds. Then I added that I would testify for him. His whole tone changed and he got excited, thanking me over and over. He even said he still loved me, which made me feel sick. I told him I'd see him in court and hung up. The next morning, I called the prosecutor's office and asked to speak to someone about Christopher's case. They connected me with Hannah Pendleton, a victim witness advocate assigned to help people testify. She suggested meeting at a coffee shop near the courthouse instead of at her office, which I appreciated because it felt less formal and scary. I got there early and picked a table in the back corner where I could see the door. Hannah showed up exactly on time, carrying a leather folder and wearing practical clothes, not a suit like I'd expected. She sat down across from me and got straight to the point without any small talk. She explained exactly what testifying meant, walking me through the process step by step. I'd be subpoenaed, which meant I legally had to show up. The defense attorney would try to make me look like a bitter ex-girlfriend seeking revenge. The judge might limit what I could say about my own experiences with Christopher. She asked what safety measures I needed and whether I wanted Christopher to be kept away from me at the courthouse. Her straightforward approach made me feel less scared and more prepared for what was coming. She didn't make any promises about the outcome or tell me everything would be okay. She just gave me facts and options, which was exactly what I needed. Dr. Yamaguchi squeezed me in for an emergency appointment 2 days later when I called her office and told her receptionist about the upcoming testimony. She cleared her schedule and had me come in that same afternoon. We sat in her exam room and worked out a detailed plan for managing my heart during the stress of testifying. She adjusted my medication timing so I'd take my beta blocker an hour before going to court instead of with breakfast. She wrote out specific instructions for what to do if I started having symptoms while on the witness stand, including a note for the judge explaining that I might need breaks. She made me promise to bring all my emergency medications to the courthouse in my purse, not locked in my car. Then she printed out my entire cardiac history going back to the bathtub incident, highlighting the parts where doctors had warned Christopher that another shock could kill me. She put everything in a folder and told me to give it to the prosecutor. Before I left, she made me practice my breathing exercises right there in her office until my heart rate came down to normal levels. 2 days later, a voicemail notification popped up on my phone from Christopher's number. I saved it without listening to the whole thing because I could tell from the first few seconds what it was going to be. I called Hannah and told her about it, and she said to forward her the recording. When I finally played it back, Christopher's voice alternated between apologizing for asking me to lie and threatening that he'd make sure everyone knew I was a vindictive ex if I didn't help him. He said he'd tell the court I was mentally unstable, that I'd manipulated him during our relationship, that my heart problems were exaggerated for attention. Then his tone would shift, and he'd beg me to remember the good times, to think about how much we'd meant to each other. The whole message lasted almost 4 minutes. I forwarded it to Hannah like she'd asked, and she responded within an hour telling me to document and save everything else he sent. She said this kind of behavior showed exactly who he was, and it would help the prosecutor's case. In my next therapy session with Lyra, we spent the entire hour practicing grounding techniques I could use if I got triggered on the witness stand. She had me sit in the chair where I'd be sitting and then walk me through the exercises. First, I had to identify all the exits in her office, counting them out loud and describing where each one led. Then she had me notice the texture of the chair fabric, pressing my fingers into it and describing what it felt like. We practiced naming 5 things I could see, 4 things I could hear, 3 things I could touch, 2 things I could smell, and 1 thing I could taste. At first, it felt forced and awkward, like I was just going through the motions. But we rehearsed the exercises over and over until they started feeling automatic instead of something I had to think about. Lyra explained that my brain would be looking for ways to escape the stress of testifying, and these techniques would give it something concrete to focus on instead of panicking. By the end of the session, I could run through the whole sequence in under 2 minutes without her prompting me. Sebastian Marston, the prosecutor handling Christopher's case, called me the following week and asked me to come to his office. I drove downtown to the county building and found his office on the 3rd floor. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his mid-30s, with a desk covered in file folders and legal pads. He shook my hand and got right down to business, explaining the rules about what testimony he could actually use from me. He was honest about the limitations, telling me the judge probably wouldn't let me describe the bathtub incident in detail, because this trial was about what Christopher did to Clara, not about my past. I could testify about Christopher knowing I had a life-threatening heart condition, and knowing that stress could kill me. I could describe his pattern of seeing himself as the victim and blaming others for his choices, but I couldn't tell the jury everything I wanted to tell them about what he'd put me through. Sebastian didn't try to sugarcoat it or promise me I'd get to say my whole story. He just explained the legal reality and asked if I was still willing to testify within those limits. I told him yes, and he made notes on his legal pad about the specific points my testimony would cover. The next Saturday, I drove back to the apartment complex where Christopher and I used to live. I needed copies of our old lease from the management office to prove we'd lived together, and that he'd known about my medical condition the whole time. Pulling into the parking lot made my chest feel tight and my breathing got shallow. I sat in my car for a few minutes doing Lyra's grounding techniques, counting the cars I could see and naming their colors out loud. The complex looked exactly the same, with the same faded paint and cracked sidewalk leading to the office. I walked across the parking lot focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The manager was a woman named Rita who'd worked there for years, and she remembered me right away. She didn't ask any questions when I requested copies of our lease paperwork, just pulled up the records on her computer and printed everything out. She put the papers in a manila envelope and handed them across the counter. I thanked her and walked back to my car, my hands shaking slightly as I unlocked the door and got inside. That evening back at the apartment, I spread the lease paperwork across the kitchen table, and Cameron sat down across from me. He looked at the documents for a minute before speaking. "We need to talk about what this trial is going to do to you." I nodded and waited for him to continue. He explained that he'd support me through testifying, but he couldn't be my only person to lean on, that he had his own limits because of what his dad did to his mom. We spent the next hour making a list of people I could call if things got bad, writing down names and numbers of friends from my support group, my doctor's office, and Hannah's emergency line. Having a concrete plan felt better than just hoping I'd be okay. The next morning, I called the hospital where they'd brought me 4 years ago and requested my complete medical records. The woman on the phone said it would take a week to process and cost $40 for copying fees. I paid with my credit card over the phone, and she confirmed my address for mailing. 8 days later, a thick manila envelope showed up in my mailbox, stuffed so full the flap barely closed. I carried it inside and opened it at the kitchen table, pulling out a stack of papers at least 2 inches thick. The medical terminology was confusing, full of words I didn't understand, but I could follow the timeline clearly enough. The first page showed my arrival time at the emergency room, and the note said, "Patient unresponsive, cardiac arrest, resuscitation initiated." Page after page documented every medication they'd given me, every test they'd run, every conversation the doctors had with Christopher about my condition. One section had a note that said patient's fiancé informed multiple times that additional stress could result in sudden cardiac death, followed by the doctor's signature. I took photos of that page with my phone and sent them to Hannah. She called me back within an hour and asked if I could come to her office the next day. When I arrived, she had printed legal documents spread across her desk and a laptop open to a legal research website. She explained that we needed to understand the rules about something called prior bad acts testimony, which meant telling the jury about bad things Christopher did in the past. The judge might not let me describe the bathtub incident in detail, because this trial was about what he did to Clara, not about what he did to me. I felt frustration build in my chest because the jury wouldn't get to hear the whole truth, but Hannah was patient and realistic. She showed me case law examples and explained that I could still testify about Christopher knowing I had a deadly heart condition and knowing that stress could kill me. That would have to be enough. 2 days later, I was making dinner when my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. The text said it was Melissa, someone Christopher and I used to know from our old neighborhood. She said Christopher asked her to reach out because he really needed my help, and he was sorry for everything. I didn't respond right away, just took a screenshot of the message and sent it to Hannah. Then I typed back that I couldn't discuss the case and she should stop contacting me. Melissa sent 3 more messages saying I was being unfair, and Christopher was a good person who made mistakes. I took screenshots of those too, sent them to Hannah, and then blocked Melissa's number. Blocking her felt good, like I was finally protecting myself instead of just accepting whatever people threw at me. That night, I went to bed early but woke up at 3 in the morning with my heart pounding, so hard I could feel it in my throat. My chest felt tight and I was sure I was having a heart attack. Instead of panicking like I used to, I sat up slowly and reached for my emergency medication on the nightstand. I took 1 pill and then started the breathing exercises Lyra had taught me, counting to 4 on the inhale and 6 on the exhale. I focused on the feeling of the sheets under my hands and named 5 things I could see in the dark room. After 20 minutes, my heart rate came down and the tightness in my chest eased. I'd managed the whole episode by myself without falling apart or waking Cameron. The next afternoon, I was cleaning out my desk drawer when I found the old MP3 player Christopher had used that day in the bathroom. The silver device was scratched and outdated, but it still turned on when I pressed the power button. His poem from 7th grade started playing through the tiny speaker, the same recording I'd heard looping while I was dying on our bathroom floor. I connected the MP3 player to my laptop and copied the audio file, then opened the file properties to check the metadata. The details showed the exact date and timestamps from when Christopher had set the file to repeat, matching perfectly with the day of my dad's funeral. I saved all the technical information in a document and added it to the folder of evidence I was building. Hannah called me the following week and said she'd set up a meeting at her office with Clara and Jay. When I arrived, Clara was already sitting in one of the chairs, and I could see the bruising on her chest through her thin blouse. She was 72 years old with gray hair and tired eyes, and she moved carefully like her ribs still hurt. Jay sat next to her mom looking exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. We didn't talk about graphic details or compare our experiences in some dramatic way. We just acknowledged that we all knew who Christopher really was, and we were all going to tell the truth in court. Clara gave me her phone number and I gave her mine, and then we all left. The pretrial hearing happened on a Tuesday morning in a smaller courtroom than I'd expected. I sat in the back row while Carson Wallace stood up and argued that my testimony was unfair and had nothing to do with Clara's case. He said letting me testify would make the jury hate Christopher based on old relationship drama instead of focusing on the actual charges. Sebastian stood up and calmly explained that Christopher's knowledge of my medical condition went directly to his character and his pattern of behavior. The judge listened to both sides and then ruled that I could testify about Christopher knowing stress could kill me, but I couldn't describe the bathtub scene in detail. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was something. 3 days later, Cameron came with me to Sebastian's office for a preparation session. Sebastian had me sit in a chair facing him while he practiced asking me cross-examination questions, trying to sound harsh and accusatory like Carson Wallace would. We went through different topics, and I noticed which questions made my chest feel tight and my breathing get shallow. Sebastian wrote notes about those triggers and adjusted his approach to be direct, but not unnecessarily cruel. Cameron sat quietly in the corner the whole time, not saying anything but just being there. That Thursday at work, a delivery person showed up at the front desk with a huge bouquet of roses. The receptionist brought them back to my cubicle, and I opened the card to find Christopher's signature at the bottom. My hands started shaking as I carried the flowers to my manager's office. She took one look at my face and asked what was wrong, and I explained about the trial and the restraining order paperwork I was working on. She immediately logged the incident in the company system, took photos of the flowers and card from every angle, and called building security to make sure Christopher's name was added to the banned visitors list. She told me they took workplace safety seriously, and I should report anything else that felt like intimidation or harassment. I thanked her and went back to my desk, feeling protected in a way I never had before. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a blank piece of notebook paper in front of me and Dad's old reading glasses beside it. I picked up a pen and started writing about the trial and Christopher and how my chest felt tight every time I thought about testifying. I explained that I was doing this partly because Dad always said standing up for what's right matters, even when it's scary, and that I wished he was here to tell me I was doing the right thing. The words came out messy and my handwriting got shaky when I wrote about missing him, but I kept going until I'd filled 2 pages front and back. I folded the letter carefully and put it in an envelope with Dad's name on it, then tucked it into the drawer where I kept his watch and his favorite coffee mug. Writing everything down made my eyes burn with tears, but it also made me feel less alone somehow, like Dad was still listening even though he couldn't answer back. 3 days later, I walked into Lyra's office for our scheduled session, and she had 2 chairs set up facing each other with a small table between them. She explained we were going to try EMDR therapy to help me process the bathtub memory without getting completely overwhelmed by it. I sat down, and she handed me 2 small buzzers that would vibrate alternately in my hands while we worked through the memory. She asked me to think about coming home that day and finding Christopher in the bathtub, then rate how distressing it felt on a scale of 1 to 10. I said 9, and my heart monitor started beeping faster under my shirt. Lyra had me follow her fingers moving back and forth while the buzzers pulsed in my palms, and I described what I remembered seeing. Every few minutes, she'd stop and ask how I was feeling and check my heart rate on the monitor, pausing whenever the numbers climbed too high. We worked through the whole memory in pieces, stopping and starting, and by the end of the session, I'd made it all the way through without dissociating or having a full panic attack. My heart rate came back down to normal after we finished, and Lyra said I did really well. Walking out to my car, I felt exhausted but also stronger, like maybe I actually could handle sitting in that courtroom after all. The next morning, I opened my work email and typed out a message to my manager requesting unpaid leave for the trial weeks. I explained I had a legal obligation to testify in a court case and needed approximately 2 weeks off, offering to stay available by email for any urgent issues that came up. She responded within an hour, approving the request with the condition that I check my inbox twice daily and respond to anything marked high priority. It wasn't ideal since I'd hoped to fully disconnect, but it was better than trying to work while testifying. My coworkers noticed I'd be gone, but nobody asked questions about why, and I was grateful they respected my privacy instead of pushing for details. And that afternoon, my phone rang with Sebastian's number on the screen. I answered, and he told me Christopher's lawyer had offered a plea deal that would avoid going to trial. The deal involved Christopher pleading guilty to a reduced assault charge in exchange for probation and mandatory counseling. Sebastian said Clara and Jay were split on whether to accept it, with Clara wanting to avoid the stress of testifying, and Jay wanting Christopher to face the full consequences. He explained the decision was ultimately theirs to make and he'd support whatever they chose. I sat with the uncertainty of not knowing what would happen, realizing I didn't get to control the outcome, and that was okay. My testimony might never happen, or it might be crucial, and either way, I'd done what I could by being willing to show up. 2 days later, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize asking if I'd be willing to do a brief interview about my relationship with Christopher. The message was professionally worded, but something about it felt off, so I forwarded it to Hannah and asked her opinion. She called me back within an hour and said it was probably Carson Wallace trying to contact me through unofficial channels, hoping I'd say something helpful to Christopher's case without realizing I was recorded or documented. She advised me to decline any contact outside of my official subpoena and not respond directly to the email. I sent a brief message through Sebastian's office stating that all communication needed to go through the prosecutor and I wouldn't be participating in any informal interviews. At my checkup the following week, Dr. Yamaguchi hooked me up to the heart monitor and frowned slightly at the readout. She pointed to a section of the graph where my heartbeat showed a mild, irregular pattern, then adjusted one of my medications to a slightly higher dose. She said it wasn't dangerous, but we needed to keep a close eye on it given the upcoming stress of testifying. She ordered an ECG for the morning of my testimony so we'd have a baseline to compare if something went wrong during or after I took the stand. Her matter-of-fact approach to my anxiety helped me stay calm instead of spiraling into worst-case scenarios. She printed out the new prescription and told me to start the adjusted dose that evening. With Dr. Yamaguchi's approval, I signed up to audit a self-defense class at the community center the next Saturday morning. I explained to the instructor before class started that I couldn't do any of the physical parts because of my heart condition, but I wanted to learn about boundary setting and threat assessment. She said I could sit on the side and observe, and she'd make sure to explain the concepts behind each technique. I watched as the other students practiced blocking moves and escape holds, taking notes on what the instructor said about recognizing dangerous situations before they escalated. She talked about how strength isn't just physical, it's also about knowing your limits and having a plan, which made sense to me. Learning to think strategically about my safety made me feel less helpless even though I couldn't throw a punch or break someone's grip. That Sunday, a local news website ran a story about Christopher's case with the headline about assault charges against a local man. The article didn't name me but mentioned that his ex-girlfriend might testify about his history of dangerous behavior. I scrolled down to the comments section and immediately regretted it. People were speculating about who I was and what I'd say, with some commenters insisting that women make things up for revenge when relationships end badly. Others defended Clara and said anyone willing to testify against their ex must have a good reason. I closed the browser and reminded myself that strangers' opinions didn't change the truth about what Christopher did to me or to Clara. Over the next few days, I created a simple packet with everything organized for my testimony. I made a timeline of events starting from when Christopher and I met through the bathtub incident and ending when I left. I included a list of all 13 medications I'd been prescribed after my heart damage with the dates and dosages. I wrote a one-page summary of what happened 4 years ago, keeping it factual and straightforward without emotional language. Hannah looked through everything when I brought it to her office and said having it all organized would help me stay focused if I got confused on the stand. The act of putting it together made me feel more in control, like I was preparing for an important test, instead of just hoping I'd remember everything correctly. A week before my scheduled testimony date, I got a message request on social media from an account I didn't recognize. The profile had no photos and had only been created a few days earlier. The message said it was someone who knew me from high school and wanted to reconnect, but something about the writing style felt familiar in a way that made my stomach turn. I read through it carefully and recognized the specific way Christopher always phrased certain things, the particular words he used when he was trying to sound casual. I took screenshots of the profile and the message, reported the account for impersonation, blocked it immediately, and sent all the evidence to both Hannah and Sebastian through email. I felt proud that I didn't engage with him or let him get under my skin, just documented everything and moved on with my day. A few days later, I sat across from Sebastian in his office while he prepared to grill me like I was the enemy. He told me to pretend he was Carson Wallace, and that I needed to stay calm no matter what he said. He started asking if I was bitter about Christopher moving on with someone else, if I wanted revenge for how our relationship ended, if I was making things sound worse than they really were. I practiced giving short answers and then stopping instead of trying to explain everything at once. When he asked why I waited 4 years to come forward, I said I didn't come forward. I was subpoenaed. When he suggested I was exaggerating my heart condition, I just said the medical records speak for themselves. Sebastian nodded after each answer and told me I was doing exactly what I needed to do. The practice made my chest feel tight, but it also made the real thing seem less impossible. We went through different versions of the same questions for almost 2 hours until my responses felt automatic. By the end, I could answer without my voice shaking or my hands trembling as much. That Thursday, the judge held a hearing about what I could actually say on the stand. I sat in the back of the courtroom with Hannah while Carson argued that my testimony was too prejudicial and would make the jury hate Christopher before they heard the facts. Sebastian countered that Christopher's knowledge of my medical condition was directly relevant to his character and his pattern of behavior toward vulnerable people. The judge listened to both sides and then ruled that I could testify about Christopher knowing stress could kill me and about him scaring me afterward, but I couldn't go into graphic detail about the bathtub incident itself. The jury would get special instructions about how to consider my testimony since it was about prior bad acts. Sebastian told me afterward that this was a reasonable outcome, and we should work within these boundaries instead of fighting for more. I felt frustrated that the jury wouldn't hear the whole story, but at least I could say something. The night before my testimony, I barely slept at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw myself on the witness stand forgetting everything, or having a heart attack in front of everyone. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and pulled out a notebook. I wrote down my testimony in simple bullet points, just the basic facts without any emotional language. Christopher and I dated for 13 years. I have a severe heart condition requiring 13 medications. He knew another shot could kill me. 3 months after the bathtub incident, he jumped out to scare me anyway. I had to crawl to get my medication while he watched. I left that same night. Writing it all down made me feel more prepared, even though I knew the actual questions would probably be different. I read through the bullet points over and over until I could recite them without looking. The sun came up and I still felt anxious, but at least I had a script in my head. Dr. Yamaguchi's office squeezed me in for a baseline ECG at 7 in the morning. The nurse attached all the electrodes to my chest and told me to stay still while the machine recorded my heart rhythm. The printout showed my heart rate was elevated from anxiety, but everything else looked stable. Dr. Yamaguchi came in and reviewed the results, then wrote a letter for the court explaining my medical accommodations. She handed me the letter and told me I was stronger than I thought, which made tears start running down my face. She gave me a tissue and reminded me to take my emergency medication with me and to ask for breaks if I needed them. I thanked her and left with the letter folded in my purse next to my pill organizer. Hannah met me at the courthouse entrance at 9 to walk me through everything before the trial started. She showed me where to go through security, where the witness room was located, where all the bathrooms were on that floor, and where the back exit was if I needed to leave quickly. We walked the route from the witness room to the courtroom twice so it would feel familiar when I actually had to do it. She pointed out where the bailiff would be standing if I needed help, where the water pitcher was at the witness stand, and where she would be sitting so I could look at her if I got overwhelmed. The courthouse felt huge and intimidating, but knowing exactly where everything was made it slightly less scary. Hannah reminded me that I could ask the judge for a break at any time, and that no one would think less of me if I needed one. That afternoon, Cameron and I talked about his plan for the trial day. He admitted that sitting in the courtroom might be too hard for him because of his own history with his dad abusing his mom. I told him I understood, and that I didn't want him to push himself past his limits just to support me. We agreed he would wait in the courthouse cafeteria, and I would text him during breaks, so he knew I was okay. He asked if I was sure I didn't need him there, and I said having him nearby, but not forcing himself to watch was exactly what I needed. I appreciated that he knew his boundaries instead of pretending to be fine when he wasn't. We ordered takeout that night and watched a movie to keep my mind off the next day, but I couldn't really focus on anything. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse with my medications in my purse, Dr. Yamaguchi's letter in my hand, and Hannah waiting for me at the security checkpoint. Christopher was in the hallway near the courtroom doors with Carson, and when he saw me, his whole face changed. He tried to catch my eye and started to move toward me, but I looked straight ahead and followed Hannah to the witness room without acknowledging him at all. My heart was beating, so hard I could feel it in my throat. Hannah closed the door behind us, and I sat down in one of the chairs, focusing on my breathing like Lyra taught me. My hands were shaking, but I was here, and I was as ready as I was ever going to be. The trial started with opening statements, and I watched on a video monitor in the witness room. Sebastian stood in front of the jury and laid out the facts of what Christopher did to Clara in clear, simple language. He described how Christopher punched Clara repeatedly in the sternum when she asked him to stop drinking around her daughter, how Clara ended up in the emergency room with severe bruising, and how Christopher showed no remorse afterward. Then Carson got up and argued that Christopher was defending himself from Clara's verbal attack, that her injuries were exaggerated, and that this was a case of mutual conflict blown out of proportion. Listening to him twist everything made my stomach turn and my chest feel tight. I took one of my medications and kept watching. Clara took the stand and the courtroom went completely quiet. She described coming to her daughter's apartment and finding Christopher drunk in the middle of the afternoon. She said she asked him calmly to stop drinking around her daughter because it was causing problems in their relationship. Christopher got angry and started yelling at her. Then when she didn't back down, he walked up to her and started punching her in the chest over and over. Her voice shook when she talked about the pain and the fear, but she didn't cry, just stated exactly what happened. She showed the jury photos of the bruising on her sternum and talked about the ER visit and the follow-up appointments. The jury looked horrified and several of them were leaning forward in their seats. I felt proud of Clara for being so strong up there. After Clara finished testifying, the judge called the lawyers up to the bench for a conference. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see Carson gesturing and looking frustrated while Sebastian stayed calm. The conference lasted about 10 minutes while everyone in the courtroom just sat there waiting. When the lawyers went back to their tables, the judge spoke directly to Carson and reminded him about the boundaries that had already been set for questioning witnesses. Carson nodded, but he looked angry. The judge called for a 15-minute recess, and I texted Cameron to let him know I was okay so far. The bailiff opened the door to the witness room and called my name. Hannah stood up with me and walked beside me down the hallway until we reached the courtroom doors. She squeezed my arm once, and then I was walking alone down the center aisle with everyone watching. My legs felt shaky, but they kept moving. The bailiff gestured to the witness stand, and I climbed the 2 steps up to the chair. He held out a Bible, and I put my right hand on it while raising my left. I swore to tell the truth, and nothing but the truth, then sat down in the wooden chair that felt too hard under me. I looked at the jury box instead of at Christopher, even though I could feel his eyes on me. My hands were shaking in my lap, but when I stated my name for the record, my voice came out steady and clear. Sebastian stood up from the prosecutor's table and walked toward me with a calm expression. He asked me to state my relationship to the defendant, and I said Christopher was my ex-fiancé. Sebastian asked when our relationship ended, and I told him 4 years ago. He paused and then asked why it ended. I took a breath and explained that Christopher knew I had a severe heart condition that made me vulnerable to sudden cardiac death. I said the doctors had warned him clearly that any stress or shock could kill me. I told the jury that despite knowing this, Christopher had done something that put me in the hospital and nearly killed me. The judge had already ruled I couldn't describe the bathtub scene in detail, so I kept it simple and factual. I said Christopher knew exactly what my medical condition was, and he knew another shock could be fatal. But 3 months after the doctors warned him, he deliberately scared me when I came around a corner in our apartment. The jury members were leaning forward in their seats, and several of them were looking at Christopher with different expressions on their faces. Sebastian thanked me and sat down. Carson Wallace stood up immediately and buttoned his suit jacket as he walked toward the witness stand. He asked if I was here today because I was angry that Christopher had moved on with someone else. I took a breath and paused like Sebastian had taught me in our practice sessions. I said no, that was not true. I was here because I received a subpoena. Carson tried again, suggesting I wanted revenge because Christopher had left me. I kept my answer short and said I left him, not the other way around, and I was simply following the court's order to testify. He asked several more questions, trying to paint me as bitter and vengeful, but I stuck to brief, factual responses without getting defensive or emotional. After about 10 minutes of this, Carson sat down looking frustrated. Sebastian stood up for redirect examination and approached the witness stand with a folder in his hands. He asked the judge for permission to show the jury my medical records from 4 years ago, and the judge nodded. Sebastian opened the folder and showed the jury pages with highlighted sections. He read aloud from the doctor's notes about how they had explicitly warned Christopher that another shock or severe stress could cause sudden cardiac death. He asked me directly if Christopher knew about my heart condition when he scared me around the corner 3 months after I got out of the hospital. I said yes, he absolutely knew, because he had been in the room when the doctors explained everything. Sebastian asked if there was any possibility Christopher didn't understand the seriousness of my condition, and I said no. The doctors had been very clear and very specific about what could kill me. The connection between what Christopher knew back then and what he did to Clara now was obvious to everyone in the courtroom. Sebastian asked me one more question. He asked me to describe Christopher's character based on the 13 years I had known him. I looked directly at Christopher for the first time since sitting down. His face was pale and his hands were gripping the edge of the defense table. I said Christopher was someone who hurt people and then saw himself as the victim. I said he blamed everyone else for the consequences of his own choices and never took real responsibility for the pain he caused. The courtroom went completely silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a second. Sebastian thanked me and told the judge he had no further questions. The judge told me I could step down, and I stood up carefully, making sure my legs would hold me. Hannah was waiting at the back of the courtroom, and she guided me out through the side door into a quiet hallway. We walked to a small room with a couch and chairs where I could sit away from everyone. My heart monitor was beeping faster than normal, and Hannah helped me check the readings on my phone app. The numbers were elevated but not in the danger zone. I used the breathing techniques Lyra had taught me, counting 4 counts in and 6 counts out until my heart rate started coming down. Hannah brought me water, and I took one of my emergency pills just to be safe. I felt completely exhausted, like I had run a marathon, but I also felt relieved that I had said what I needed to say. Hannah told me I did really well up there and that my testimony was powerful. Over the next 3 days, the trial continued with more witnesses and closing arguments. I didn't go back to the courtroom, but Hannah kept me updated by text. She said the jury looked serious during deliberations, and everyone was expecting them to come back with a verdict soon. But then on the 4th day, Hannah called me and said Carson had approached Sebastian about a plea deal. Christopher would plead guilty to a reduced assault charge instead of going to trial. In exchange, he would get 3 years of supervised probation instead of prison time. He would also have to complete a year of batterer intervention classes and 6 months of alcohol treatment. The deal included a permanent no-contact order protecting both Clara and me, meaning Christopher couldn't contact either of us ever again for any reason. Hannah said Clara and Jay were meeting with Sebastian to decide whether to accept the deal. She explained that going to trial was risky because juries were unpredictable, and there was always a chance Christopher could be found not guilty. A few hours later, Sebastian called and said Clara and Jay had agreed to accept the plea deal. He said it wasn't the prison sentence they had hoped for, but it was real consequences and real protection. 2 weeks later, I went back to the courthouse for the sentencing hearing. This time I sat in the gallery with Clara and Jay while Christopher stood in front of the judge. The judge asked if I wanted to give a victim impact statement, and I said yes. I walked up to the microphone and read from the paper I had prepared. I talked about how Christopher's abuse had affected my health and nearly killed me. I said his pattern of hurting people and refusing to take responsibility had continued for years. I said I hoped the court would hold him accountable so he couldn't do this to anyone else. When I finished, I walked back to my seat without looking at Christopher. Clara gave her statement next, describing the physical pain from the assault and the fear she still felt. The judge listened to everything and then sentenced Christopher to 3 years of supervised probation with strict conditions. He had to complete batterer intervention classes for a year and alcohol treatment for 6 months. He had to pay all of Clara's medical bills and court costs. The judge made the no-contact order permanent and said any violation would result in immediate jail time. It wasn't prison, but watching Christopher's face fall as the judge read the sentence felt like something. A week after sentencing, Hannah arranged a meeting at her office with Clara, Jay, and me. We sat around a small conference table and exchanged phone numbers. Clara gave me information about a support group for domestic violence survivors that met twice a month. Jay shared the name of her therapist who specialized in trauma. I told them about the cardiac support group I attended and the resources Dr. Yamaguchi had given me about stress management. There was no dramatic bonding moment or group hug. We were just 3 women who had survived the same man, sharing practical information about how to stay safe and keep healing. Before we left, Clara squeezed my hand and thanked me for testifying. I told her she was brave for pressing charges in the first place. A month after the trial ended, I had a follow-up appointment with Dr. Yamaguchi. She did a full cardiac exam with an ECG and an echocardiogram. When she showed me the results on her computer screen, she was smiling. My heart function had actually improved slightly from my last exam 6 months ago. It wasn't a huge change, but it was measurable improvement. Dr. Yamaguchi said she felt comfortable reducing one of my medications under careful supervision. She explained that successfully managing the stress of the trial without a major cardiac event proved how much stronger my heart had gotten. She said the improvement was likely due to reduced chronic stress now that I was away from Christopher and in a healthier relationship with Cameron. I left her office feeling like I had won something small but real. When I got home that afternoon, Cameron was making dinner in the kitchen and asked how the appointment went. I told him about the improved heart function and the medication reduction while I set my purse down on the counter. He smiled and said that was great news, then turned back to stirring something on the stove. We ate together at our small table, and I brought up something that had been on my mind since the trial ended. I said I didn't want to make any big life changes right now, that I just wanted to focus on small things that felt manageable. Cameron nodded and said he felt the same way, that we should take things slow and steady. He suggested maybe planning a weekend trip somewhere quiet next month, nothing fancy or stressful. I liked that idea, and we talked about what we each needed going forward, how we could support each other without losing ourselves in the process. He said his boundary was keeping his therapy appointments separate and having his own friend time, and I said mine was maintaining my medical routines without feeling guilty about them. The conversation felt healthy and real, like we were actually partners instead of one person taking care of the other. After dinner, I helped him clean up the dishes, and we watched a movie on the couch before bed, just normal couple stuff that felt good because it was simple. That Saturday morning, I drove to the cemetery where Dad was buried. The weather was sunny and warm, not the gray, rainy day I expected for something like this. I parked in the small lot and walked across the grass to his headstone, carrying a folded piece of paper in my pocket. When I got there, I knelt down and pulled out the note I had written the night before. I told him I had testified in court and that I was okay, that Christopher was being held accountable for what he did. I wrote about Cameron and how he helped me build a life that actually felt safe instead of constantly scary. I told Dad about my improved heart function and how Dr. Yamaguchi said I was getting stronger. The note wasn't long or poetic, just honest updates about my life like I was catching him up on things. I folded it back up and tucked it under a small rock near his headstone so the wind wouldn't blow it away. The grief I felt sitting there wasn't the sharp pain from right after he died, more like a steady ache that I could carry alongside everything else. I stayed for a few more minutes just sitting in the quiet, then stood up and walked back to my car. On the drive home, I stopped at a coffee shop and got myself something sweet, feeling like Dad would have wanted me to do something nice for myself. That night, after I got back to the apartment, I pulled out the cardboard box from my closet and filed away all the court documents from Christopher's case. I labeled the box with a marker and pushed it to the back corner where I wouldn't see it every day. Then I walked to the kitchen and updated the emergency contact list on the fridge, making sure Cameron's number was first and adding Hannah's office number as a backup. I pulled out my phone and went through all my social media accounts, double-checking that Christopher was blocked on everything, and his number was still blocked in my phone. After that, I took my evening medications one by one, swallowing each pill with water and checking them off on my daily tracker. I set my alarm for the next morning and plugged my phone in to charge on the nightstand. Cameron was already in bed reading something on his tablet when I climbed under the covers next to him. He reached over and squeezed my hand once before going back to his reading. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing, doing the techniques Lyra taught me to calm my heart rate down. My body relaxed into the mattress and I felt my mind start to drift. For the first time in months, I fell asleep without any nightmares, just peaceful darkness until morning. And that's the story. I know it was heavy, but I'm so glad we went through it together. If you're dealing with something similar, please know you're not alone. Drop a like if this resonated with you, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care of your heart, okay?